Hello, my name is Dr. Laist, and today I want to talk a little bit about the role of character in James Joyce's short story, Eveline. James Joyce's very short story, Eveline, provides an excellent example of how a talented writer can evoke a complex and nuanced situation in just a few pages. Eveline is such a short story that its plot can be fairly summarized in a single sentence. Eveline Hill, faced with a choice between whether to stay in Dublin with her family or leave with her boyfriend for a new life in Buenos Aires, opts at the last minute to stay behind. Of course, there is much more to Eveline's situation than is stated in this summary, but the action of the story is focused in such a way as to draw our attention to the inner world of the story's main character rather than to the unfolding of events. As a result, Eveline is a character-centered story rather than a plot-centered story. Our engagement with the narrative requires a close examination of Eveline's own point of view, and the conclusions we draw about the story will ultimately depend on how we interpret Eveline's own perception of the people, places, and things in her environment. That said, Joyce does use a basic beginning, middle, end plot structure to guide us through Eveline's world. In the first third of the story, Joyce introduces us to Eveline's home and her memories of her family. In the middle section, beginning in paragraph 10, Joyce introduces a new element, Eveline's relationship with Frank, whose invitation to Eveline to come away with him establishes the story's central conflict. In the final section of the story, which is divided from the rest of the story by a section break, Eveline and Frank are boarding the ocean liner when Eveline makes her decision, if indeed it can be called a decision, to stay behind. Although we can analyze the plot in this way, the way we feel about Eveline's choice, did she do the right thing or the wrong thing? Why does she act the way she does at the end of the story? Is her behavior a sign of courage and self-awareness or cowardice and paralysis? Will depend on our reading of her character. Indeed, the suspense of the story hinges on the ambiguity of Eveline's character. We can see her going either way. We see why she might be attracted to both of her mutually exclusive options. The story is so expertly crafted that the very question of whether Eveline should be considered a round or a flat character is debatable, making Joyce's story a perfect starting point for analytical discussions and interpretive essays. Although Eveline is not written in the first person, Joyce shows us everything in the story from Eveline's perspective, providing us with direct access to her thoughts and memories throughout the beginning and middle of the story. The point of view shifts somewhat in the last paragraph of the story, where suddenly we see Eveline from a third-person perspective, but we are in her head, or at least looking over her shoulder, for the majority of the narrative. The resulting narrative is a blend of outward descriptions of the things around her and inward impressions of her emotions and memories. When Joyce tells us in the opening paragraph that Eveline, quote, sat at the window watching the evening invade the avenue, end quote, we learn the objective facts that Eveline is looking out at a window at the evening, but the same sentence also carries psychological and symbolic significance. We see her alone, separated and framed off from the world around her by the window. The emotional tenor of an invading evening conveys a mood of gloom and vague threat. The dusty curtains and the deserted street, likewise, convey not only narrative details, but emotional cues about Eveline's state of mind. Joyce's recurring depictions of the dustiness of the house represent a particularly noticeable example of how a descriptive detail can also communicate information about Eveline's character. Her thoughts on the pervasiveness of the dust in her home recall the statement about human life as a progression from ashes to ashes and dust to dust that is associated with burial services, a hint that an awareness of death, also symbolized by her brother Ernest and her mother, may be weighing heavily on Eveline's mind, even if she is not consciously putting that particular thought into words. In this symbolic sense, the dust in Eveline's home may also indicate other symbolic qualities, inertia, futility, entropy, and decay, for example, that are also influencing her mood. Similarly, the other details that Eveline observes in her environment, the field that has been turned into a housing complex, the portrait of the nameless priest, and the broken harmonium, can be interpreted as having a symbolic significance for Eveline, at the same time that they provide clues regarding the background of Eveline's home life and the appearance of her community. Eveline's point of view also informs the depiction of the other characters in the story. The most prominent supporting character in Eveline is arguably Eveline's father. The way Eveline's father is introduced into the story establishes him as a figure of violence and fearful authority. He breaks up Eveline's playfellow's play, brandishing his brutal blackthorn stick. In this brief scene, Eveline's father symbolizes the harsh realities of time and adulthood. He breaks up Eveline's Edenic childhood with his phallic instrument of authority. Eveline's father's unaccountable rage is of a piece with his drunkenness. Whether he is drunk, raging, or both, he represents a basic force of irrationality. He is a force of nature that can only be managed rather than reasoned with, and his domestic tyranny connotes the male-dominated world that Eveline inhabits. He may be drunk, brutish, and feckless, but he is the man of the house. He wields the blackthorn stick, so his rule is law, however senseless it may be. This image of Eveline's father as a flat fairy tale monster is tempered somewhat by some of Eveline's more tender memories. Quote, he had read her out a ghost story and made toast for her at the fire, end quote, or, quote, they had all gone for a picnic to the Hill of Howth, end quote. But these depictions of Eveline's father's softer side only serve to make his daily cruelties appear crueler and more irrational. The other major male character in Eveline's story, the sailor Frank, is introduced as an explicit contrast to the character of the father. Whereas Eveline's home houses the broken harmonium, and Eveline's father is described chasing itinerant organ players away from his house, Frank, quote, was awfully fond of music and sang a little, end quote. Whereas Eveline's father represents the harsh realities of the life she has known, Frank's character is loaded with romantic associations, tales of globe-trotting adventures, operatic fictional narratives, economic independence, and the unimaginable destination of Buenos Aires, the place of good air, contrasting starkly with Eveline's dusty house, on the other side of the world. Of course, it is no wonder why Eveline would be smitten with such an exotic apparition. The reader may be justified in questioning the integrity of Frank's intentions. Frank may be simply too good to be true, in which case Eveline would be right to listen to her father, since, as hard as her life is in Dublin, it is probably preferable to the situation she would be in if Frank abandoned her in a foreign country. On the other hand, Frank's affection for Eveline seems sincere, and he seems genuinely distressed when she doesn't follow him onto the boat at the end of the story. Ultimately, there is no way to have any certainty about Frank's intentions either for Eveline or for the reader. Joyce may be suggesting that such questions are entirely unknowable, perhaps even to Frank himself, suggesting the inherent risk and unpredictability that underlie most of life's important decisions. Ultimately, however, it seems as though the most influential figure in Eveline's life is neither of these two men, but is in fact her mother. Eveline's deceased mother is mentioned several times throughout the story, but she is introduced as an important character toward the end of the story's middle, when a tune from a street organ triggers Eveline's memory of her mother's final days. Eveline's memories of her mother's final days emphasize two episodes which act together to depict the double bind, the impossible position, that constitutes Eveline's situation. On the one hand, Eveline remembers the promise she had made to her dying mother, quote, her promise to keep the home together as long as she could, end quote. This solemn commitment understandably places a heavy burden on Eveline, asserting her responsibility to devote her life to holding together the pieces of her shattered family, caring for her abusive father, as well as for, quote, the two young children who had been left to her charge, end quote. As if to warn Eveline against following her heart and abandoning her family in order to pursue a life of romance and fulfillment, Eveline's mother, in her terminal madness, warns Eveline that the end of pleasure is pain. Her use of Gaelic to express this dour aphorism loads the sentiment with a sense of prophecy, as if Eveline's mother is voicing the wisdom of ancient druids rather than the hard lessons of her own sad life. As Eveline remembers her mother's words on the eve of her possible departure, it is as if Eveline's mother is returning from the grave to admonish Eveline to keep her promise. At the same time, however, Eveline recognizes her mother's madness and death as a result of the hard domestic toil that had constituted her entire life, quote, that life of commonplace sacrifices closing in on final craziness, end quote. Eveline's mother's dementia provides Eveline herself with a glimpse into her own future. If she stays, if she submits to her father's bullying, if she gives up on the dreams represented by Frank, she can grow up to share the same terrifying fate as her mother. As Eveline follows this line of thought, it seems to motivate her to break with the life pattern represented by her mother. Quote, escape, she must escape, end quote. But when she hesitates and then shuts down at the threshold of her new life, her mother's influence seems to reassert itself. The final image in the story is one of blankness and inscrutability. Quote, she set her white face to him, passive, like a helpless animal. Her eyes gave him no sign of love or farewell or recognition, end quote. Likewise, the image gives the reader little sign of what Eveline's sudden paralysis means, why it occurs, or how we should feel about it. Where the story ends is where the act of interpretation begins, and Joyce, who once famously commented that he wrote his masterpiece Ulysses with the intention of keeping future generations of literary critics busy, leaves us with plenty to speculate about at the end of Eveline. Starting with the most obvious question, we can ask whether, within the context of the story, Eveline made the right decision. Thesis statement. Although everyone might not agree with Eveline's decision to stay in Dublin, her decision is rooted in her identity and her history, and is therefore the right decision for her. Or, conversely, thesis. Eveline's decision to stay in Dublin is motivated by cowardice and insecurity. We might even go a step further and try to evaluate the role of the specific social influences that operate on Eveline throughout the story. Thesis. Eveline's decision is influenced by her religion, her economic status, and her identity as a woman. Delving a little deeper, we can trace the manner in which Joyce represents Eveline's character. Thesis. Eveline is a round character whose thought processes change as the story develops through the beginning, middle, and end of the narrative. Or thesis. Although Eveline has many conflicting feelings over the course of the story, her character is essentially flat and unchanging. Approaching the story from a feminist perspective, we might analyze the role of gender in the story. Thesis. The representation of the story's three major male characters, Eveline's father, Frank, and Harry, demonstrate the degree to which men enjoy greater freedom than women in Eveline's Dublin. Or thesis. Although Eveline's life seems dominated by men, her decision at the end of the story demonstrates that she has been empowered and inspired by women like her mother and Blessed Margaret Mary Alacoque to trust her own intuition. Eveline also lends itself to dual readings regarding the meaning of Eveline's mother's dying words. Thesis. Events in the story support Eveline's dying mother's pronouncement that the end of pleasure is pain. Or, conversely, thesis. Events in the story demonstrate the folly of Eveline's dying mother's pronouncement that the end of pleasure is pain. Although Eveline is a very short story, it is rich enough in detail, artistry, and psychological depth that it can support all of these thesis statements in one way or another. James Joyce himself was so divided on his own feelings about the Dublin of his childhood that, although he left Ireland shortly before the publication of Dubliners and never returned, he spent the rest of his life writing about the people and places of Dublin, minutely detailing the life of this city in his great novels. His passionate ambivalence about what it means to leave or to stay in Dublin resonates with the ambivalence felt by many people in a culture in which the values of family and home often conflict with the values of independence and personal desire. As we sort through Eveline's story to comprehend the meaning of her choice, therefore, we are also holding a mirror up to our own conflicted attitudes about our own life choices.